lead negotiator in collective bargaining and labor organizing. My presentation tonight draws on formal study and 20 years of negotiating experience. If I were to mention one book to read first as a result of this presentation tonight, it would be Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher. If you haven't already read this book, write it down now. It's a skinny book. It's well worth your time. And I think of it as kind of the Strunk and White of negotiations. And its central thesis that negotiations don't always need to be exercises in sheer compromise, where neither side is happy with the outcome, is a thesis I agree with. So why discuss negotiations with you tonight? Some of you are musicians, learning to articulate your value in the world as performers and teachers. Understanding your value in the marketplace in which you work is an essential first step in preparing for any negotiation. This conversation will likely concern any organizational work that you do, where your professional interests coincide with colleagues, committees, work groups, etc. Fact is, life is one long negotiation between individuals, co-workers, lovers, family members, you name it. And underlying these negotiations are material gains, losses, and plenty of emotions. My hope is that after our talk tonight, you will begin to see the problems in negotiator. Whether you realize it or not, we are all negotiators. You could say that life itself is one long negotiation, the act of placing oneself satisfactorily in the context of a larger whole, a classroom, a family, a marriage, a community, a profession, a football team, a religious congregation, a political body, a government. You get my drift. The question is, what kind of negotiator are you? What kind of negotiator will you be? Is the art of the deal the act of breaking a weaker party's knees and taking all the value he, she may have for your benefit only? Or is the art of the deal more complex than that? Is it possible that parties on different sides of the table will benefit more from a deal which mutually benefits all parties, a deal strategically sought with the aim of collective gains for all invested parties? Let me give you a thumb sketch of two different approaches to negotiations. The first is thought of as a cooperative, integrative approach to negotiations. And there's a story, it's become a proverbial story of the orange peel and the inner fruit story. Imagine two young sisters, Emily and Lucy, fighting over one orange. Both want the whole orange, and the argument escalates before Mom steps in. In an effort to stop the fighting and be fair to both children, Mom grabs the orange, cuts it straight down the middle, and gives each child an equal half. But the whining continues and even escalates. Mom asks the question, "What's wrong?" Emily explains that she needed the whole orange to squeeze out enough juice to complete her orange cake for the school baking competition. And Lucy explains that she needed the whole orange because her class was having a competition to see who could peel the longest orange rind in one continuous spiral. If only the girls had spoken to each other to explain what they wanted. If only Mom had stopped to ask both girls what they each needed from the orange in the first place. Then both girls' needs could have been satisfied. Lucy could have peeled off all the orange rind, and Emily could have juiced the whole orange for her cake. That would be the classic win-win outcome. The split orange is the outcome of a compromise solution which leaves both parties unhappy and leaves potential value wasted on the negotiation table. The most successful negotiations always involve compromise. But compromise itself should not be the goal of a good negotiation. The attainment of meaningful value specific to your needs is most important. Sometimes such specific value is more important to you than it is to your bargaining partner, like the rind and the fruit to the two sisters. So with the integrative model of bargaining, typically we divide, in this kind of a simple way, the object as interests and positions. So if we think for a moment about the two sisters, the position each held was, I need the whole orange. And they insisted on the fact that each needed the whole orange. Mom comes along and sees that they're entrenched in their positions, and she just says, fine, I'll split it. It's better than getting nothing. But a different conversation would have been to find out, well, what were the interests behind the positions that the girls struck? And the open-ended question would have probably revealed the fact that they both wanted the whole orange for different reasons. And that in this case, it would be possible for both to be satisfied with one whole orange. So that's kind of the classic way to think of interests and positions. And usually, to find out what the interests are from a bargaining partner means you got to ask questions. You have to be willing to talk. When parties are cooperative, they tend to listen to each other's interests, to foster good feelings about each other, and trust comes more easily as a result. One party's loss is not necessarily the other's gain. Goodwill has a way of expanding possibilities and gains for each party. The pie they are sharing gets bigger for them both. But you got to talk. You have to ask, why do you need X? What are the interests behind your demand? What a world that would be. Mediators most commonly use interest-based techniques to help parties reach mutually beneficial agreements, but not so many negotiators who are strictly working as advocates. Now, that describes that cooperative model. Another model, if we were just to look on the spectrum, and obviously we're taking the ends of the spectrum, but the competitive, zero-sum approach to negotiations is also sometimes needed, but it's predictive of certain results often. And there's sometimes a story is used to illustrate the most extreme competitive negotiation. So a truck driver is barreling his 18-wheeler down the road into a narrow ravine and sees another 18-wheeler coming from the opposite direction directly toward him. The road narrows into a one-lane passage at the bottom of the ravine. Both drivers have an opportunity to pull over before their rigs crash head-on. But the first truck driver is hell-bent on forging straight ahead and doesn't want to pull over. Instead, he grabs a spare steering wheel from the passenger seat and hangs it out of the window as he increases his speed toward the ravine. The second driver sees the detached steering wheel and makes a decision based on whether or not he believes the first driver has an ability to pull his rig to the side. The second driver decides it's in his best interest to pull over and let the other rig pass. The first driver's committed approach wins the day. But what if the second driver decided the first was bluffing and continued straight ahead? Sometimes negotiations become wars, strikes, etc. Sometimes it's unavoidable, I suppose, but is winner take all ultimately the best solution? When parties are competitive, they tend not to listen as well and do not value the other's interests, but rather stick to positions. As a result, less information is shared, and with that, a tendency for there to be less trust. One's gain is the other's loss. While one party may gain more than the other as a result of winning the negotiation, the total value of the pie available to both parties has probably shrunk. Often such solutions are crude and lack the nuance of a more mutually beneficial agreement. This is why enemies have such a difficult time negotiating. There is simply less material to work with because both sides keep information close to the vest, often by necessity. But this positional competing can also happen in personal and professional relationships, and the results often run counter to the desired benefits from such relationships. To my mind, trust is the coin of the realm when it comes to successful negotiations. But is kumbaya always the answer? What I haven't mentioned thus far are the boundaries in which negotiations are contained, the side rails, the limitations provided by the possibility of escalated conflict. Fear of catastrophic conflict may, in the end, encourage the integrative, interest-based negotiations I've been talking about. Such a dichotomy, isn't it? One could argue that effective international diplomacy is possible because, without it, there would be war. Labor negotiations are often successful because, without agreement between labor and management, there could be lockouts and strikes, both of which pose existential threats to capital and labor interests. So, what techniques work in your negotiation lives? I'm using examples that are simplistic in a sense. They're kind of either or, but I'm just trying to illustrate maybe opposing techniques. But one kind of negotiation we all have is a short-term, one-off relationship. If you're buying a car from a dealer who you'll never see again, or perhaps buying a Turkish rug from a dealer on your once-in-a-lifetime trip to the Middle East. Maybe you fight for every last cent of value because you believe the dealer is inclined to gouge you on price. Here, the dealer's gain is your loss. Maybe in this instance, short of any moral complexities or certainties about the overall market, you need to compete on price as much as possible to be sure you are getting fair value or better. But in long-term relationships, in which you may be bargaining repeatedly over many issues, such as in labor negotiations, your approach should probably be different. So too in personal relationships. Such negotiations may produce more value if you engage in integrative bargaining, which prioritize the interests of both parties and produces results which meaningfully benefit both parties. Don't forget, you'll be bargaining again with that same partner before you know it. And now I want to expand these concepts of bargaining and talk to you about what I do as a labor negotiator representing my professional musician colleagues. As mentioned, I'm Vice President of the Boston Musicians Association, American Federation of Musicians, Local 9535. I am the Chief Negotiator and work with orchestra committees in collective bargaining agreements. I am also hired by other AFM locals to negotiate deals that are especially difficult for that local, only the fun stuff for me. What is a collective bargaining agreement? Collective bargaining agreements are deals made between a group of workers whose union is recognized by the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to represent them in negotiations over terms and conditions under which they work. These may include wages, benefits, work hours, breaks, workplace temperature, protections from harassment, fair hiring practices, due process through the Grievance and Arbitration process over disciplinary actions, including suspensions and job termination, etc. The Grievance and Arbitration process allows the worker a specific kind of justice system backed by the NLRB in which he or she may challenge unfair treatment by the employer, which are contrary to provisions in the collective bargaining agreement. The same holds true for the employer when it believes the union is violating the agreement on behalf of the workers. In this sense, the CBA, that's the collective bargaining agreement, we call it a CBA, functions as a kind of conflict resolution mechanism with due process built in, and the NLRB and the neutral arbitrator acting as the lawful decision makers as opposed to the civil courts. Collective bargaining provides an opportunity to leverage the power of a large group to gain beneficial terms and conditions for the whole. This contrasts with the gains one person, acting as a free agent, would be able to achieve for him or herself. Not many of us, as individuals, are able to go it alone effectively. For most of us, it's all about strength in numbers. Of course, the challenge to a negotiator who leads collective bargaining is to organize the common interests and positions of that same large group he or she represents. As you probably already understand, creating consensus among many strong-minded people in a collective can be extremely difficult. Sometimes it's, as they say, like herding cats. But I find that my work with orchestra committees is at the heart of everything I do. A committee represents the whole orchestra. They are elected by their colleagues. They are close to the concerns of their colleagues. As lead negotiator, I've learned that I often need to be more of a facilitator, one who enables the committee to carry the weight of their colleagues in a strategic and effective way. As you build your professional careers, it may be worth your while to study the ways of small work groups. There's a fair amount of literature on the subject, and you are likely to find yourself managing small group dynamics in many instances throughout your life. And what about unions? I realized over many years representing musicians in negotiations and managing conflicts between the musicians and the employers that much of my job is to help support the dignity of my colleagues who work so hard in a business that is extremely challenging. So much expertise of a professional musician is required in orchestras, so much practice, so much education. And it seems our work only gets more challenging from year to year. Certainly during this time of COVID, when so much work is vanishing, musicians need to preserve what they can as we wait for the pandemic to end. As fortunes change, seemingly day by day, and pressure mounts on the employers to navigate minefields of problems, it is ever important that the musicians are part of the conversation. Our music is the product, yet orchestra institutions, in their effort to survive, have a way of overlooking the very folks who make all the noise on stage. Our union contracts have guaranteed us that the employers work with us on changes in response to the pandemic. Dignity is not all about money, though money certainly helps. The best unions in various work sectors support their members and give them a sense of agency. You may find one day that having little control or say about your working conditions may wear you down and perhaps cause despair. Being able to harness the collective strength of your colleagues in a proven way to bolster spirits and maintain a better life for you and your family, that's what unions are about. You may have learned about the shoemakers, textile workers, railroad workers, truckers, miners, telephone operators, etc., from the last 2 centuries. You may have heard about that industrial period in our cities when our government actually built stone armories, architecture replicating medieval European castles, to house the National Guard and protect against civil unrest. Much of the unrest was, in fact, labor unrest, strikes, protests. Many people died fighting for workers' rights. So many of those stone armories remain, now convention halls, restaurants, even community centers. But don't forget how hard many fought to make unions legal under the National Labor Relations Act. Today, when so many in the United States are struggling to make a living wage, I believe that all of us need to take a closer look at what leverage unions can potentially provide workers of all stripes. We need to consider reinvigorating the union movement in the United States. It's time we give more strength to the principle that everyone deserves the opportunity to make a living wage. I mentioned to you that the Boston local is part of the American Federation of Musicians. And I wanted to give you just a little perspective on the AFM. As mentioned, musicians have a long history of union activity. The AFM began in 1896 when musicians gathered in Indianapolis and organized the American Federation of Musicians for, quote, any musician who receives pay for his musical services, end quote. Representing 3,000 members, AFM was granted a charter by the American Federation of Labor. Wherever there was music, there were musicians organizing in the early 20th century in theaters, restaurants, nightclubs, hotel ballrooms, amusement parks, carnivals, symphonies, operas, ballets, and increasingly at theaters as accompaniment for silent films. In 1927, the first talkie film was released. It's called The Jazz Singer. And within 2 years, 20,000 musicians lost their jobs performing in theater pits for silent films. This was not the first or the last time that technological advances would transform musicians' work. Yet musicians remained strong and established minimum wage scales for Vitaphone, Movietone, and phonograph record work. In 1938, film companies signed their first contract with the AFM. Musicians continued organizing in orchestras, radio, and in the making of film scores. But musicians were losing income as phonorecords replaced radio orchestras, and jukeboxes competed with live music in nightclubs. In 1942, AFM members embarked on one of their biggest campaigns, a recording ban. Musicians went on strike in 1942, shutting down the United States recording market for 2 years until they won. This would be an instance of hard competing on a certain position to support some interests. By standing together, they forced the recording industry to establish a royalty on recording sales to employ musicians at live performances. And with those royalties, they started something called the Musicians Trust Fund. And that through that trust fund, which was funded by the royalties from recording, the musicians would give free concerts all over the United States. And they were paid through the monies that were collected in the trust fund. Numerous labor actions in the following decades improved industry standards and working conditions for musicians. New agreements covered TV programs, cable TV, independent films, and video games. Pension funds were established. Musicians also secured groundbreaking contracts, providing royalties for digital transmissions and recordings of live performances. So the object of the American Federation of Musicians, and that's the union of musicians. It's the largest advocacy group for professional musicians in the world. The object is to bring order out of chaos and to harmonize and bring together all the professional musicians into one progressive body. And that was said by the AFM's first president, Owen Miller, in 1896. 120 years later, AFM musicians continue standing together, 80,000 musicians playing in orchestras, backup bands, festivals, clubs, and theaters, both on Broadway and on tour, also making music for film, TV, commercial, and sound recordings. I thought it would be useful to actually show you segments of what a collective bargaining agreement looks like. Could you focus on the document camera? So there are a few, there's a lot to a collective bargaining agreement. I'm not going to show you a whole agreement, but I wanted to pick up some pieces that you're also likely to see in another collective bargaining agreement. So if you're a teacher or a faculty member, you'll see some of these things. The hallmark of an agreement is its term, how long it lasts. And you can see here that with this, and this is an agreement between the Boston Musicians Association and an orchestra that we bargain with. It's typical that we do 4-year deals now. We used to do 3, but we find that the 4 years gives the organization enough time to plan. So if we've built in raises and this kind of thing, they can fundraise for it. So I would say in the past 15 years, we've been doing more 4-year deals. A really important feature is the union recognition. I don't know how many of you would be familiar with what union organizing is. But when you go into a workplace and you organize the workers, at some point, there's a whole process, but at some point they need to take a formal vote. And it's a private, secret ballot that's run by the NLRB. And the vote is to decide whether they want a particular union to represent them to bargain on their behalf terms and conditions of their employment. So it's funny, you know, there are so many contracts that I do, the recognition clause is tucked away there and it's just a given. But if you're an organizer, you realize how difficult it is to get recognized, for your union to be recognized, for the bargaining unit to be certified by the NLRB. Many times the organizing process is contentious. It's usually management teams don't want to see the workers organize, although we've had some friendly management teams too, but we've had some hotly contested elections as well. So the recognition clause is essentially saying, and it's in the contract, that the entity, the symphony orchestra, recognizes the union to bargain terms and conditions for the musicians. And I mentioned to you before that I work really closely with orchestra committees. The legal bargaining agent is the union, and that's as set up by the NLRB. But I think any union that goes into a negotiation and bargains without paying attention to what the workers want, and bargains without really working with them for a long time to find consensus as to what they want to bring to the table, then I think that union's not doing its job, and it probably won't be successful. Bargaining a first contract is tricky business, and it usually takes a lot of time, and you're really setting up the relationship between the union and the employer, but just as important, the union and the bargaining unit, all those people that the union is representing. So in that work, I find that the orchestra committee is incredibly important. And it takes a lot of skill to be on these committees. And you remember a while back I mentioned the idea of studying work groups. I mean, there's a certain psychology of work groups, and it's a really dynamic social group, and committees certainly are playing right into that small group psychology, essentially. And something that you'll see in a union contract will be protections against discrimination. Those clauses continue to get more supportive of non-discrimination. You know, a funny story, it's not a funny story, but it's a true story. So not so long ago, the orchestras in the United States were virtually all men. 50 years ago, if you went to a concert, I mean, you're really looking at mostly men on stage. 60 years ago, you might not see a single woman. And one of the things that the unions were responsible for were in the audition process, when an opening occurred, the unions really helped create better process, more fair process. They put an end to the idea that if you want to be in an orchestra, you're not going to go play a private audition for the maestro. That there needs to be a process, that it's advertised, that there's a committee, that as opposed to these private auditions, which were quite plentiful in the old days. And it had all the problems that we've seen in other places. And one result was there were no women. So they began, in the auditions process that was developed by the unions and the committees, we began to put up screens. So if you're going to take an audition in this hall, there'd be a screen across the whole front of the stage. The audition committee will be sitting in the audience where you are. And the candidate would enter from the door here in back of the stage. And many times I've seen it, if it's a woman, they're instructed to not wear heels on the stage, to come out, so that the committee has no idea if it's a woman or a man. And if you, as a result, and also the changes in culture, but our orchestras are easily half female now. We have other challenges in our industry relative to discrimination, and we've got some work to do. But in terms of gender, at least, I think that the screen has been a great help, and that's a result of process having to do with the musicians and their union bargaining into their contract certain ways that musicians can join an orchestra. You'll see types of musicians. So, in orchestras, being a tenured member is jealously guarded. It's an achievement. It means that you're a member. You have a position. You're called first. And the contract does afford some privileges to members. Not so much pay, but essentially first call, and also the committees that members can serve on. So usually a contract will delineate among musicians that work for the employer. But every musician in our contracts is covered under the collective bargaining agreement. And you see some of the things I said for roster member. And then here you can see the audition procedures. So it's very specific, and this is a full section. I just cut out a little bit, but you could see that how the voting goes is part of the contract. Usually the music director has more weight than any committee member, but there are stipulations about in contracts about when you can have a conversation about candidates, how you score candidates from behind the screen. It gets amazingly detailed, sometimes too much so, but it's a really important subject. The subject of how someone joins an organization, and also the subject for how someone leaves an organization. Those are two of any organization, I think those are the two greatest elements of any kind of agreement or any culture that's centered around an organization. And then there are issues around pay. So I didn't put that in here, but there would be wages. There's overtime. Exactly. I mean, look at this one here. If overtime occurs during a regular service, now in this case, the regular service is 2.5 hours long. Each musician will be compensated 1/6 of their per service rate for each 20-minute increment of overtime or portion thereof. So you can see these contractors get really granular when it comes to money. And some of these things they're common, so you don't have to relearn these terms every time you look at a contract. But it's surprising how some do differ. And then, in the case of this orchestra, and it's not uncommon that we have people traveling to play with an orchestra. So we have, there are all kinds of provisions around travel. Reimbursement for mileage. There's also hotel. So and then when the the orchestra's on tour, there's a lot of tour language. You have to decide, what kind of buses, what kind of planes, when you can leave, when you can't, how many hours in a day that you can travel. Can you rehearse after you've been traveling? Can you perform on the same day you've been traveling over 5 hours? These kinds of things. It really gets involved. But it's important because you can really get beat up on tours. It's very tiring. When you get on stage, no one cares if you're tired. You have to produce as if you're full of life. So we try to make touring language not interfere with the artistic integrity of our musicians. And here you could see what's happening here is we're defining what a service is and how long it is. So I mentioned that a service is typically 2.5 hours. Now that means if you play the triangle and you come in and you have to play maybe 3 minutes of music in that 2.5-hour service, you're paid like everybody else. You're part of the team. That moment in the concert could be incredibly important. So you're paid as just like everybody else. Sometimes in negotiations, I find that some of the people that are on boards, many times they own businesses. They pay people by the hour. And they'll see something like that and they say, well, why is this person getting paid the same as everybody else? And we actually have to have that conversation. So something like the service length and its definition is very important in a musician's contract. And then earlier, I mentioned to you about grievance and arbitration. This one includes mediation. So in some ways, the grievance and arbitration clause of a collective bargaining agreement is the foundation of the whole contract, because that's kind of the lawful bedrock of the contract. If there's any breach of the contract or perceived breach, the grievance and arbitration clause defines how that conflict will be settled. And I think I mentioned earlier that in some ways you could look at a collective bargaining agreement as almost a document of dispute resolution. It's an efficient way, hopefully, of laying out the rules and laying out the process for finding justice within the contract. So ideally, we're not going to have a court case that goes on for a year or two. I mean, it is possible that there are elements of a contract that can wind up in civil courts, but for the most part, everything is settled in the end by a third-party neutral arbitrator, and that's it. The arbitrator can't go outside the restrictions of the contract, but the arbitrator can make a decision, and that's it. So it can be, I think it can be a really efficient way of honoring a contract. And because it's efficient, at least in our local, we don't have many grievances. Everybody knows it's better to figure it out than to take it to grievance and arbitration. Some locals in some sectors, some work sectors, it's not the case. And the conflicts are settled many times with an arbitrator. But one of the things when I'm drafting a contract, that I'm always, or bargaining a contract, I'm always thinking, okay, play out this clause that you're writing. How's it going to be resolved if it goes to a grievance? Is the information there? Is it clear? So an arbitrator can make a clear decision. And then I work back from there. So the clause is logical, it's lawful, it's not ambiguous, and because of that, you're less likely to have a grievance, because we're not going to be arguing about the meaning of the clause. So good drafting is really important. in these situations. So I've given you a lot of information about concepts in negotiation, individual, collective, and then we've discussed unions and how that kind of organizational work interacts with negotiation theory. We're not in a place where we can do this, but many times if I'm doing a class, we'll have a whole period where we have this interactive period, and I set up a negotiation, and there are different people spread out around the room coming to agreements. And of course, we can't do that tonight. What I thought I would do is, just so we can think about a narrative that might trigger your thoughts in a certain context. And I'm gonna read through a scenario to you. And let's just read it through. We're not gonna be able to have a group exercise on this. But I'll leave you with the narrative that hopefully brings in a lot of the things we talked about. Okay, so this narrative is actually derived from a very true story. I've changed the names to protect the not so innocent and the innocent, but it give you a sense of some of the work that we do. So this trio, we're going to call them Bravissimo, and they're going to tour the United States. But they're really from Europe, and they have a presenter from Europe who needs to access American musicians to back these singers up, these European singers, these Italian European singers. So we need American musicians to tour, and that means that this presenter has to work through a contractor who's an American, who knows the venues around the country. And of course, the American Federation of Musicians has a strong interest in touring acts, because we discussed a little while about all that goes into travel. Musicians are taken advantage of often with touring shows. And so we want to do a touring contract to protect the musicians and make sure they're paid properly. But you'll see with this scenario, there are some competing interests, let's say, which are real world. And it's it's very hard to bargain these deals, and it gives you a sense of the complexity. So I'll just read this to you. The Bravissimo Trio is hot these days. They are showered with praise wherever they go, even when touring internationally beyond their native Italy. They fill concert halls and arenas with adoring fans, especially middle-aged women, some tickets selling for as much as $800 in major American cities. The three well-coiffed young men with sweet tenor voices are known for singing traditional Italian folk songs, but easily segue to Puccini or the Beatles as they swoon from style to style. The concert production requires a 40-piece classical orchestra to back the trio on United States tours. A good orchestra can prepare the book adequately with a couple of 3-hour rehearsals. However, a 1-hour sound check is necessary before the show begins in each new venue. And that's so we can get a sense of the acoustics and the miking and that kind of thing. Maria is Bravissimo's trio's agent. The shows sell well in the States, and she can afford to pay a reasonable fee for a 40-piece professional orchestra. She does not know much about what is required for travel, etc., but trusts that Bert will take care of the musician's needs. That includes any problems with the American unions, which seem to get in the way sometimes when a producer is trying to provide good art to loving audiences. So the agents in our sample negotiation are going to be, you can see those there. So there's Maria, who we've talked about. There's Bert, the American producer. There's Karen, and she's the musician contractor. She's actually the person who Bert hires to call the musicians and hire them for the tour. And then there's Michael. He's the American Federation of Musicians touring business manager. So Michael's job is to take care of these kinds of acts that are touring around the country. And there can be many. And it's a hard job because each tour has its own needs, but there are also constants that we expect for our musicians. And then there's Frank, and he's the Fresno, California Musicians Union president. And there's Kelsey. She's a musician and the AFM union steward, and she actually lives in New York. And you can see we have a tour schedule here. Starts in Fresno. It starts in Fresno. You can see the rehearsals. There's a concert. It goes to San Diego, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and then it winds up in Boston. So on the musician side of the negotiation table, I've mentioned some of the characters to you. I'll read out some of the problems we face. There's been a recent trend of productions touring without sanctioned American Federation of Musicians contracts. This often leaves the musicians without basic protections, fair wages, pension, adequate per diem, decent hotels and travel arrangements, so they're traveling non-union. Sometimes rehearsals extend beyond the promised limits, and the musicians go without overtime pay. Michael, remember he's the AFM representative, is finding that musicians in the non-AFM touring orchestras are paid unequally because the contractor, and that would be Karen, does separate deals and pays as little as possible depending upon a given musician's bargaining power. Now remember before I was talking to you about the difference between a free agent and someone who's part of a collective. So the free agent typically doesn't have as much leverage. Without a legal AFM contract, the AFM is unable to help stranded musicians caught in unfair deals. But some musicians need work so badly, they simply take what they can get. Michael is under pressure from the AFM to get these productions under union contract before they hit the road. The worst case for him is a decision by Maria and Bert to send out the tour as non-union production. Most important are wages, pension, and lodging. Here's what the bosses at the AFM expect Michael to gain for each musician. $350 per concert, $70 per hour for rehearsals, doubles at 20% for the first, 15% for the second, 10% for the third. That's when a musician plays more than one instrument. Pension, 10% of the total wage. Lodging, single occupancy. $50 per day per diem. That's a little low. Plane travel provided when the distance between venues is over 200 miles. Otherwise, bus provided. So that's what Michael's trying to get. And then there's Frank. And he's the local president in Fresno. And that's where the Bravissimo Tour is going to begin. Frank has been a local president for decades and has seen the music business decline in his city. Many of his musicians are not working, and membership is flagging. He wants to see more tours originate in Fresno so that more of his local members will work, and he wants to make the touring contracts friendly enough so the producer is not tempted to hire local musicians from the various other cities to which the production is touring. Karen is a playing contractor, so she's actually a violinist from his local and supports his connection with Bert, the American producer who brings in big touring acts from all over the world. Frank knows that the AFM requires higher rates for their contracted tours than does his Fresno local. So the Fresno local only requires X amount of money to play certain jobs, but the AFM, of course, is looking at the whole country and at many locals, so its rates are higher than the Fresno local rates. But he believes less is just fine in this struggling economy, where a few of his musicians are surviving, let alone prospering. He prefers the following rates: $275 per concert. Now, you remember we were comparing that to $350 a concert. $50 per hour for rehearsals, as opposed to $70. Doubles at $20 for the first, $15 for the second, $10 for the third. That's the same. Pensions not 10%, he prefers 5%. Single occupancy lodging. I'm surprised he didn't ask for double occupancy or triple. $40 per day per diem, that's below the 50. Plane travel provided when distance between venues is over 300 miles, otherwise bus provided. So those musicians under his plan will spend a lot more time on a bus. Kelsey. She's a touring musician who plays French horn and serves as union steward on tour. So the union steward, for those of you who don't know, would be the person that knows what the contract deal is and makes sure that the employer follows the contract. So the steward is always checking, and it's usually a pretty involved job because when a musician has a complaint, the musician goes to the union steward. Kelsey is a young French horn player, graduated from Juilliard only 4 years ago. She is starting to perform with some of the better orchestras in New York City and is experiencing solid wages and working conditions stipulated by her union, AFM Local 802. And that's one of the strongest locals in the United States. The work pays more in New York, but of course it costs a lot more to live in New York. She knows Michael at the New York City AFM touring office and appreciates the need to provide decent wages for touring musicians. Even though she enjoys playing so much, she would do it for free. Well, at least if her food and travel are covered. So that's another thing that we musicians do. Musicians work really hard, and when they're coming up, there's not much work, and they love what they do, and they don't mean anything by it, but sometimes they'll play for nothing. And occasionally that's a problem for the people who are working. And that is a dynamic that we face. Musicians, they play to make a living, but they started for a lot of other reasons. And that's a dynamic that's peculiar to artists who are trying to make a living wage. Michael would like Kelsey to represent the musicians on the Bravissimo Trio US tour to ensure that whatever AFM contract is negotiated with management will be honored from city to city. She is not from the originating city, which is Fresno, but is looking forward to the tour stop in her hometown when Bravissimo performs at Radio City Music Hall. Kelsey really wants to play this tour and worries that Michael may not be able to successfully negotiate an AFM-sanctioned contract. If Michael is unable, her work will go away as a result because she has heard the contractor is trying to hire as many Fresno musicians as possible, and most likely would hire a Fresno French horn player if they can't do this deal. So then on the management side of the table, we talked a little bit about Maria. Maria has a great eye and ear for talent and has discovered an audience in Europe for singers who have operatic voices, but also sing standards, some from the ethnic folk repertoire of various European audiences, and some from American pop standards. She has found that American audiences appreciate the European slant, especially with the American music itself. Maria always hires talented and sexy solo performers capable of gaining a cult following. She insists on a well-rehearsed classical orchestra with a full complement of instruments to back up her performers. Since she does not speak much English and does not know the American market well, she is heavily dependent upon Bert, the American producer, to make everything work. The shows sell well in the States, and she can afford to pay $50,000 USD per performance for a 40-piece orchestra. She does not know much about what the orchestra musicians require for travel, etc., but trusts that Bert will take care of everything. That includes any problems with their unions, which seem to get in the way sometimes when a producer is trying to provide good art to loving audiences. And then there's Bert. Bert's an American producer with ties to all the major American venues. He knows them all. Bert knows the music scene like the back of his hand. He has been around for a long time, first working for his father in the old days when live music was everywhere in the dance halls, concert halls, theaters, and even the radio stations, which employed live orchestras. His father was a union president in the big city where Bert grew up. But Bert finds musicians to be a major pain in the butt with all their complaining. He prefers to pay them as little as possible. Bert was a terrible violinist and never made it as a performer. He knows musicians are suckers for any work that will allow them to indulge, and he doesn't mind making money off their backs. As for travel, he remembers how musicians used to ghost their hotel rooms on tours, sometimes 3 or 4 staying in the same room and splitting their double occupancy hotel allowances among them. He would rather not even provide hotel allowances for that reason, and there is nothing more disturbing to him than an overbearing union representative. He enjoys telling those guys to jump off a bridge. Sometimes he has to do a deal with the union because he has no other choice, but mostly tries to hide as much from the union as possible. He has decided that if things get bad enough with the AFM negotiations, he will send the tour out non-union and risk union job actions in a couple of the fussy cities where the trio is touring. He expects that Karen, with whom he has a close personal relationship, will deflect any issues that arise with the musicians she has hired. That said, Bert certainly does not want producers like Maria to think he cannot access the finest US musicians, and is wary of any labor unrest which could disrupt the shows he brings to the various American venues, not to mention his good business relationships with the venue managers themselves. But he also considers every dollar he keeps from the musicians a personal victory. He wants at least $10,000 a performance and would like to give the musicians $200 per concert, $35 per hour for rehearsals, no doubling pay, no pension, double occupancy lodging, $35 per day per diem, plane travel provided when the distance between venues is over 500 miles. Otherwise, bus provided. Karen, she's the contractor who works for Bert, plays concertmaster in his touring orchestra. Karen is a mid-career musician, a member of Frank's Fresno Local, a frequent contractor of small orchestra concerts. She has always felt like a B-lister musician, not among the elite who pull down the best work in the Fresno Philharmonic. Lately, she's had the opportunity to contract touring orchestras for Burt, and is enjoying the glamour of the big halls around the country, and frankly, the power she has to tell the touring musicians what to do, some of whom attended the Juilliard School in New York City. She has been subject to other whims for too long. Karen and Burt enjoy cutting on the musicians when talking privately in his office, making backhanded comments about some that they like least. Karen belongs to the Fresno Local Union, but could care less about what the union stands for. She makes nice with Frank, but believes he is a little crooked, and knows that he is prone to look the other way on her contracting shortcuts as long as she helps keep members in the union working. She doesn't believe that Burt pays her nearly enough for contracting, dealing with all those late-night calls, cranky musicians, etc. Burt pays her a flat $500 per show to do all the contracting. So she does not feel too badly about pocketing money that she can keep from the musicians. She wonders if she could transport the musicians from Fresno to San Diego on the first leg of the tour by bus rather than plane, given that the distance is just a little over 500 miles. That would save her a good chunk of money right at the start of the tour. Here are some of the ways she is able to keep conditions vague with the musicians, especially if there isn't a union contract. No full written contract. Karen prefers to work things out over the phone and get a general acceptance through email. She tells the musicians that she's not wild about hiring union-loving musicians. So don't be running to the union every time you feel a sneeze coming, she says. She avoids paying the musicians through payroll, but rather uses an app to transfer funds. So that's a real scenario. And you can imagine, earlier we were talking about interests and positions. Think about how they're all in conflict here. Money is at the root of it all. You have a presenter who wants a tremendous amount of money per show. There's not a lot of clarity or transparency about issues. And if we were setting up a negotiation, you would each have your role, but you wouldn't know everything that you know now, because I've read you everybody's story. So the expectations with each scenario are different. So you can imagine how complicated it can be. And for Michael, the AFM rep, to come up with the contract that he's been assigned to get is a really hard job. It's made more difficult because it's not like he can get these people to strike easily. They're going all over the place. It's very hard to organize people in that fashion. People need money. So and also in Michael's case, he knows that if he can't do a deal with the management side, they're likely to say, fine, we're just going to go out non-union. And then the union's going to have to chase them all over the country. So you could see how much is riding in a negotiation like that. This is, in some ways, more difficult than working with an orchestra that's settled in a city. You know everybody that plays in the orchestra. There's kind of a culture around the orchestra. And that could be really difficult to bargain a contract like that. But the expectations are a little bit more, they're not as fluid as a situation like this. So I leave you with that narrative, and I leave you with all these open ends. We didn't get a deal. We didn't solve this. But I hope that we've opened up enough thoughts about negotiation and the problems you might face in industries other than the music industry as you go forward. The whole theory of negotiations, there's a whole academy around it. Harvard Program in Negotiations has tremendous material. I think it's fascinating. I'm always learning, and it's been my pleasure to talk with you tonight. Thank you very much.